Donald Trump putting pressure on Canada on the eve of a trade deadline, hours before making his threats real.
We like Canada. I love Canada. I have so many friends in Canada. But they've been very poorly led. They've been very, very poorly led. And all we want is fairness for our country.
Tonight News, he signed an executive order increasing the tariff on Canada from 25% to 35% effective Friday.
When Donald Trump entered the White House in January 2017, few could predict the seismic shifts his presidency would bring to global trade dynamics. Among his most aggressive moves was his attempt to reshape the trade relationships of the United States with its closest neighbors Canada and Mexico. Through a series of tariffs, trade restrictions, and renegotiated deals, Trump would ignite a trade war that would not only challenge long-standing agreements, but also force countries like Canada and Mexico to reconsider their economic strategies and alliances. Trump's presidency, defined by a commitment to America first, was grounded in the belief that previous trade agreements, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, had unfairly disadvantaged U.S. interests. One of his first acts as president was to withdraw the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a trade agreement meant to strengthen economic ties between the United States and Pacific Rim nations. This move set the stage for further actions aimed at transforming global trade in a way that would benefit U.S. industries and workers, but it also set the stage for a dramatic escalation of tensions with Canada and Mexico. Trump's push to reassert American dominance in trade policy quickly moved into high gear when he imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports in March 2018. These tariffs, set at 25% for steel and 10% for aluminum, targeted imports from several countries, including Canada and Mexico, both of whom were the largest suppliers of steel to the U.S. This decision wasn't just about numbers and trade balances, it was an ideological stance. Trump was determined to restore American manufacturing, particularly the steel and aluminum industries, to their former glory. In Canada, where steel and aluminum producers had long depended on trade with the U.S., these tariffs hit hard. The United States had long been Canada's largest trade partner, and the imposition of tariffs meant that Canadian goods became more expensive for U.S. consumers. As a result, Canadian manufacturers found themselves facing tough economic challenges. To make matters worse, these tariffs seemed particularly unfair given that Canada, a key U.S. ally, had already agreed to extensive security measures to protect the U.S. from international threats. The impact on Mexico was just as significant. Mexico's economy is deeply integrated with the United States, particularly in the agricultural and automotive sectors. The imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum was a direct blow to Mexican industry. The steel tariffs not only made Mexican-produced steel more expensive, but also put pressure on U.S. manufacturers that relied on cheap steel imports to build vehicles, electronics, and machinery. For many workers in the automotive industry, particularly in Mexico's maquiladora factories, the tariffs meant layoffs and uncertainty. The tariffs weren't just about steel and aluminum. Trump's broader approach to trade included slapping tariffs on goods from China, the European Union, and other countries. However, it was the decision to impose these tariffs on Canada and Mexico, two countries that were supposed to be the U.S. closest economic partners, that created the most immediate fallout. As these nations attempted to negotiate, Trump's rhetoric only became more hostile, suggesting that the trade imbalances were detrimental to the U.S., and that Canada and Mexico needed to pay for these perceived imbalances. The response from Canada and Mexico was swift. Both countries were determined not to let U.S. tariffs go unchallenged. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs unacceptable and vowed to fight back. Less than 2 months after the U.S. imposed the tariffs, Canada announced it would impose its own tariffs on $12.6 billion worth of U.S. goods, including products like whiskey, ketchup, and orange juice, all of which were carefully selected to target key states in the U.S. that were important to Trump's political base. It wasn't just about retaliation. It was a strategic effort to hit U.S. industries where it would hurt the most, both economically and politically. At the same time, Mexico's government took similar action. President Enrique Peña Nieto, and later his successor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, implemented tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, including pork, apples, and flat steel. These moves were designed to strike at U.S. farmers and manufacturers, who were important stakeholders in the regions most supportive of Trump. Mexico's retaliatory tariffs weren't just an economic measure, they were a diplomatic response to what the Mexican government saw as unjust trade practices by its northern neighbor. These retaliatory tariffs sparked fears of a full-blown trade war between North American neighbors. As trade flows between the US, Canada, and Mexico slowed, businesses on both sides of the border were forced to adapt to new realities. For industries like automotive manufacturing, agriculture, and electronics, the tariffs made it harder to conduct business across borders. Manufacturers had to pay higher prices for parts, and farmers were left struggling to find new markets for their crops. The NAFTA replacement, USMCA. With tensions at an all-time high, both Canada and Mexico began to recognize the need for a resolution. But what kind of agreement would work for all three nations? For Trump, the goal was clear: renegotiate NAFTA, a deal he argued had been unfair to the United States. His administration's demands were aggressive: more protections for American intellectual property, a stronger automotive manufacturing sector, and greater access to Canadian dairy markets. After months of contentious negotiations, the three countries finally reached a new agreement in late 2018, called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. The deal replaced the decades-old NAFTA, but it reflected many of Trump's trade demands. In the new agreement, Canada and Mexico made some significant concessions, particularly in areas like agriculture and intellectual property, but the deal was a clear victory for Trump's America First agenda. For example, the agreement raised the percentage of automobile parts that must be made in North America, which would benefit U.S. manufacturers, but potentially drive up prices for consumers. Canada was forced to allow greater access to its dairy markets, a move that angered many Canadian farmers who saw it as a sellout to U.S. interests. Mexico, meanwhile, agreed to new labor reforms and environmental protections, both of which were largely in line with Trump's push to modernize trade relationships in North America. The USMCA was seen as a diplomatic victory for Trump, who was able to present it as proof of his success in fixing what he perceived as a broken system. However, the New Deal did little to ease the underlying tensions that had been created by the tariffs. While it avoided the worst-case scenario of a full-scale trade war, it left many questions unanswered about the long-term sustainability of trade relations between the three countries. The economic fallout: winners and losers. The economic impact of the trade conflict between the US, Canada, and Mexico was felt across many sectors. While Trump's administration claimed that the tariffs would bring jobs back to the US, the reality was much more complicated. For US consumers, the tariffs led to higher prices for goods, ranging from cars to electronics to food. The increased cost of materials like steel and aluminum drove up the cost of manufacturing, affecting industries such as construction, automotive, and technology. In Canada and Mexico, the tariffs caused significant disruption. Canadian businesses that relied on exports to the US were particularly hard hit. Canada's automotive and agriculture sectors faced massive uncertainties. In Mexico, the impact was especially severe in the agricultural sector, as tariffs on products like pork and tomatoes severely limited the country's access to one of its largest export markets. Farmers in the US were also hurt by the trade war. With retaliatory tariffs from countries like China and Mexico, U.S. agricultural exports were significantly reduced. To compensate, the Trump administration introduced financial aid packages for U.S. farmers. But this was seen by many as a temporary band-aid that did little to address the long-term challenges facing American agriculture. While the U.S. government sought to shore up the farming industry, the damage to global trade relations was already done. For Canadian and Mexican workers, the trade war also caused uncertainty and fear. Jobs in industries reliant on U.S. markets were suddenly at risk, and both countries found themselves scrambling to diversify their economies and find new markets for their goods. The legacy of the trade war. While the immediate trade war between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico appeared to ease with the signing of the USMCA, the long-term legacy of Trump's policies remains uncertain. The decision to impose tariffs created deep divisions within North America, forcing both Canada and Mexico to reassess their economic strategies. The U.S. was able to extract some concessions, but the price for those gains was a fractured trade relationship that will take years to heal. Looking forward, the future of trade in North America will depend on a variety of factors. Can the three countries continue to work together under the framework of the USMCA, or will the legacy of Trump's policies continue to divide them? As new administrations take office in the US, Canada, and Mexico, the relationship between these countries will remain a critical issue in the realm of international trade. However, one thing is certain: the trade revolt triggered by Trump has left a lasting mark on the economic landscape of North America. How Trump's wrong policies are destroying the economy and affecting the world. Donald Trump's presidency was marked by bold claims and sweeping promises, but the economic policies he implemented during his time in office had far-reaching consequences. These policies, particularly his protectionist stance, tax cuts, deregulation, and withdrawal from international agreements, have caused significant damage not only to the U.S. economy, but to global economic stability as well. While Trump argued that his policies would benefit American workers and industries, the reality has been much more complicated, with many facing adverse effects that continue to ripple across the globe. 1. The trade war and its consequences. One of the most high-profile aspects of Trump's economic policy was his trade war, which particularly targeted China, Canada, and the European Union. He argued that the U.S. had been taken advantage of by these countries in trade deals, particularly under agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. His solution? Slapping tariffs on imports to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and protect American jobs. In theory, Trump believed that imposing tariffs would bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., but in reality, this policy led to a cascade of negative effects. The most immediate consequence was the rising costs of goods. With tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other imports, U.S. manufacturers had to pay more for raw materials, which, in turn, resulted in higher prices for consumers. The automotive and electronics sectors, both reliant on global supply chains, were particularly affected. While Trump boasted about bringing jobs back, many businesses simply outsourced jobs to countries with more favorable trade terms, exacerbating the problem. The retaliatory tariffs from other countries also hurt American industries. Mexico, Canada, and the EU all imposed tariffs on U.S. products, particularly agricultural goods. U.S. farmers, already struggling with declining incomes, were hit hard by the loss of export markets. The trade war, instead of boosting American industries, left workers in agriculture and manufacturing grappling with job losses, higher costs, and a shrinking global market for their products. 2. The tax cuts and their long-term impact. Another signature policy of Trump's presidency was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Trump promised that the tax cuts would stimulate economic growth, raise wages, and create jobs, but the reality was far less rosy. The tax cuts primarily benefited corporations and the wealthy, with little trickle-down effect for ordinary American workers. The corporate tax rate was slashed from 35% to 21%, and many companies used the savings to buy back stock rather than invest in job creation or higher wages. The resulting wealth inequality became even more stark. The top 1% of earners saw their wealth skyrocket, while middle and working-class families saw modest, if any, improvements in their economic conditions. Furthermore, these tax cuts were not accompanied by a reduction in government spending. Instead, they contributed to ballooning federal deficits and a rapidly increasing national debt. In the long run, these policies could lead to austerity measures, cuts to social programs, and higher taxes for future generations to cover the debt incurred. 3. Deregulation and environmental impact. Trump's approach to regulation was another key part of his economic agenda. His administration rolled back numerous environmental regulations designed to curb carbon emissions, protect air and water quality, and preserve public lands. These deregulation efforts were driven by the belief that cutting red tape would unleash economic growth, particularly in industries like oil, gas, and coal. However, the consequences of this deregulation have been far-reaching and destructive. The environmental impact of abandoning climate change regulations is immense. The U.S. withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, which undermined global efforts to tackle climate change and opened the door for more pollution and environmental degradation. While the energy sector may have seen short-term gains, these policies came at the expense of long-term environmental sustainability, public health, and global leadership in clean energy innovation. Furthermore, the loss of environmental protections had adverse economic effects in other areas. Natural disasters, including hurricanes, wildfires, and droughts, became more frequent and severe, costing billions of dollars in damages and forcing local economies to deal with the fallout. The short-term profits gained by deregulating the energy and manufacturing sectors were overshadowed by the long-term costs of climate change and environmental destruction, which ultimately hurt the economy on a global scale. 4. Immigration policies and labor market impact. Trump's stance on immigration was another key issue that had significant economic repercussions. His administration imposed strict immigration policies that included family separations, the travel ban on several Muslim-majority countries, and efforts to limit the flow of undocumented workers into the U.S. Trump argued that these policies would protect American jobs and reduce competition for low-wage labor. However, the economic consequences were dire. The U.S. labor market relies heavily on immigrant workers, particularly in sectors like agriculture, construction, hospitality, and healthcare. Immigrants fill critical roles that are often low-paying and unglamorous, but essential to the functioning of the economy. By cutting down on immigration, Trump's policies led to labor shortages in these industries, driving up costs for businesses and consumers. In agriculture, for instance, many farms face challenges in harvesting crops due to a lack of migrant workers, resulting in food shortages and higher prices. Additionally, many industries that rely on skilled workers from abroad, such as technology and healthcare, also felt the impact of restrictive immigration policies. Limiting the flow of highly educated immigrants undermined innovation and hurt the U.S. competitiveness in the global economy. In the end, Trump's anti-immigration policies hurt both the American economy and global trade relations by limiting the workforce and stifling economic growth. 5. Global impact: how Trump's policies affected the world. While the U.S. economy was undoubtedly affected by Trump's policies, the effects were not confined to American borders. Trump's America First approach led to a decline in global cooperation and a more fragmented world economy. His withdrawal from international agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, sent a message that the U.S. was no longer committed to multilateral diplomacy and cooperation. The trade war with China and the imposition of tariffs on allies like Canada, Mexico, and the EU disrupted global supply chains and created uncertainty in international markets. Many global industries were forced to adjust their business strategies to cope with Trump's protectionist policies. Countries that were once reliant on trade with the U.S. found themselves searching for new partners, and multinational companies were forced to rethink their operations to navigate a more unpredictable global market. Moreover, Trump's foreign policy decisions undermined the United States' position as a global leader in trade, diplomacy, and innovation. His approach created a power vacuum that allowed other nations, such as China, to step in and take a more prominent role in shaping the global economic order. The U.S. retreat from international cooperation allowed China to expand its influence through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, further exacerbating tensions between the two nations. 6. The COVID-19 pandemic and economic fallout. Finally, Trump's mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated many of the economic issues already at play. The failure to adequately address the pandemic led to widespread illness and death, devastating families, communities, and businesses. The economic fallout from the pandemic was severe, with millions losing their jobs and businesses shuttering their doors. The global economy was thrown into a tailspin as supply chains were disrupted and international trade ground to a halt. Trump's administration failed to provide a coordinated federal response to the pandemic, leaving states and local governments to manage the crisis on their own. This fragmented approach contributed to the U.S. becoming one of the hardest-hit countries in the world. The pandemic further exposed the fragility of the U.S. healthcare system and its inability to respond to a large-scale crisis, which undermined both public health and economic stability. Conclusion: a legacy of economic damage. In conclusion, Donald Trump's economic policies, while rooted in the belief that they would make America stronger, ultimately caused significant harm to the U.S. economy and the global economy. The trade war, tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation, and immigration restrictions created instability, inequality, and long-term economic damage. By retreating from international agreements and undermining global cooperation, Trump's policies contributed to a more fragmented world economy, with far-reaching consequences for businesses, workers, and nations worldwide. While some short-term gains were made in certain sectors, the long-term effects of Trump's economic policies continue to be felt, and they have left the global economy in a precarious position moving forward.